Today on Ramblings with Rebecca, the ECHR. Technically, my course on human rights that's going for the whole year is not just international human rights, but also international and European human rights law. So I figured I probably should take a little while, a few ramblings, to ramble about the European system. The ECHR, the European Convention on Human Rights, which is not actually its formal title. No, it is instead the Convention for the Protection of Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms. It's an international treaty that protects human rights. It's one of several regional human rights mechanisms. So we have the UN system and all of the international treaties, which is what we've been talking about primarily in the past sessions on human rights. But then there are also these regional bodies which come with their own treaties that, just regional groups of states are signed onto, often their own regional courts, systems for protections and, complaint procedures and that kind of thing. The European Convention on Human Rights is a treaty independently of the European Union. It was drafted in 1950 by what was then the Council of Europe, and it entered into force on the 3rd of September 1953. All Council of Europe member states are party to the convention, but that's not exactly the same as the European Union. So there are states that are in the ECHR who are not European Union members. This is helpful and important to consider because it just means that it's not just an EU mechanism. And it also means that the EU has a rather intriguing relationship with the ECHR because obviously they have a lot of things overlapping as far as jurisdiction and aims and that kind of thing go, but they're not actually the same legal entities or same group of states, and that's intriguing, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on. The convention, the ECHR, established the European Court of Human Rights, the ECTHR, since of course it can't just be the ECHR. So ECHR is the convention itself, the agreement. ECTHR is the court. Any person who feels that their rights have been violated under the convention by one of the state parties can take a case to the court. The European Court of Human Rights is is the richest source of case law that we have around human rights. I think most people would say. I say this obviously not a fully qualified or authorized party, but certainly the oldest of the regional mechanisms and one that's churning out the most case law. And also one that in some issues has perhaps more progressive or liberal views on things than some of the other regional courts, but also has some interesting ways to interpret, which we'll talk about more as well. Judgments from the court that find violations of human rights are binding on the states concerned, and they are obliged to execute them. So this is also a particularly interesting setup, just because it has a good bit more teeth than most other human rights court systems do. Not all, but it certainly was one of the first that said, this court, you're really, really going to be bound to it, and a state can't refuse to, take up a case, right? Whereas in cases that go to international legal systems between states, both states have to agree to be bound by the certain adjudication around this issue, generally. An individual can sue a state, basically, and the state's obliged if it goes to the European Court, of course, if they are a party, so if they've agreed to this mechanism. And then there's this committee of ministers that monitors the execution of judgment and is making sure that any payments, other amounts, or issues awarded by the court for applicants are actually carried out by the states. This is really, really quite innovative. It's 60 years old now, but it was really, really quite a substantial step forward. Really, really big deal. Quite a big victory for human rights activists to have this kind of system. It's still the only international human rights agreement that provides such a strong degree for individual protections. Most others, you're really obliged to go through other systems. So a really, really great procedure and protocol. But of course, there are a lot of politics that come into play. So we're going to be looking for the next couple sessions on some of the issues with how the European Court of Human Rights tends to consider rights, and the absolute versus qualified rights that we talked about comes to bear on here. as do some things around state consensus and overall agreements among Europe, and of course the role of the EU. So more to come.